Hey guys, it's Thorn. Apologies for my face right off. I spent the last year kind of struggling with some kind of allergic reaction thingy, and I'm kind of in the midst of it right now. It makes me look a little bit like the Hound, but it's been about a year, so you get used to it. It comes and it goes. Anyway, I'm working with a team of specialists and have been for a long time, so it's just what my face looks like every now and then. So that's what that is. Anyway, I wanted to make this video because this is one of my most requested by far, and I sat down to kind of think about doing it, and it started sort of turning into a series, and then I kept running into these same issues, so I thought I would go ahead and kind of make a preliminary video so that y'all could see what I've been wrestling with. I've got lots of thoughts about this. So, advanced books. This is probably the number one thing I get comments about and emailed about. People want to know what comes next, particularly with that feeling that intro books are kind of all the same, and that's kind of all we get. Like year after year, there's just dozens of books about Wicca and witchcraft and paganism, but they're the same sorts of information just rehashed by different people, and that gets really frustrating, particularly if you've been around for years. So I get that, but in sitting down and trying to kind of think about what the advanced books are, we run into some questions, and I think before I can make a list of what those advanced books might be, or before you can make a list for yourself, which I think is really the ideal, we have to think about what actually is our end goal. Where are you trying to get? What do you mean by advanced? So I wanted to kind of toss out some ideas, get you guys' thoughts, and maybe we can make some recommendations to each other in the comments, etc. I'll certainly make subsequent videos with recommendations based on these various kinds of problems that I'm going to present here in a second, but just to kind of kick things off, here's what I'm thinking. So the desire for advanced books comes from a few different places, and that means different things. First, there's this idea that we've been reading, studying, practicing witchcraft for a few years and are sick of reading the same things over and over again. That's a pretty common complaint. That's one that I've had myself over the years. And that's, I think, where a lot of people are coming from. Just that they're tired of reading the same stuff. Okay, like I know how a magic circle works. I understand things about tools and the Wheel of the Year and whatever. And you know, I've been building relationships with deities and spirits and whatever. And what next? So there's that conundrum. Then there's this idea that we need something more challenging. That now that we've mastered some fundamentals of witchcraft, it's time for something that's more difficult, basically. Something that is more, takes things a step further magically. Okay, like I've done these things, what comes next? Is it just a question of me continuing to do these foundational things for the rest of my life? That's its own concern. And then finally, there's this idea that you're reading these books, we're reading these books, and there's got to be something more substantial, older, more authentic, realer, whatever word we want to use. There's just, if you've ever read a book and had a feeling that this is great, but there's something else here. There has to be something else here that isn't actually in these pages that this author is getting at, or that must be out there because it's clearly not here, and how frustrating that can be. So I'm kind of thinking of those things as like three different categories of thinking about advanced books, specifically as it pertains to witchcraft, not magic and the occult broadly, although all of those things overlap, and just generally some thoughts on those things. Okay. First off, I think the fundamental issue is that if we're looking for something to be harder, more challenging, more advanced, whatever kind of term we want to use, what ends up happening is that you end up looking beyond witchcraft. So just to give you an idea, when I decided that I wanted to kind of take things a step further with my own practice, particularly, I was spending a lot of time with the tarot. This is probably 4 or 5 years ago. I decided, I came to this wall that I kept running into, like, okay, I know these card meanings. I know how to do a reading. Like this stuff, I have a handle on what next. And I realized that I was going to have to start studying Kabbalah. Like I was going to have to look at the tarot beyond just a divination tool. And that took me down this many year-long rabbit hole of reading a lot of material that I'd always found really intimidating. And a lot of it still is intimidating. But I found that in order to strengthen my work as a tarot reader, I needed to stop reading books about tarot. And I started reading about the Golden Dawn. I started reading about Kabbalah. I started reading a lot of these texts that, people stopped writing like this beginning in like the 1910s, when tarot kind of took off as this divination, party trick kind of thing that became popular, okay, particularly in the mid-20th century. I realized that in order to go further, I was going to have to stop thinking of things that way and start reading some of these older manuals, these older guides. And often they don't mention tarot hardly at all, okay? And that's been really worthwhile, and that's really taken my tarot practice quite a bit further than where it was. And we could do the same thing with witchcraft. Regardless of what tradition you're interested in, the step before is almost always looking at anthropological texts, looking at folklore, looking at history, etc. So, for example, if you're interested in Wicca, if you're practicing Wicca specifically, then in order to go, to an older place than Wicca, to what's beyond Wicca, you have to start looking at the movements that were around as Wicca was beginning to form, that people like Gardner and Valiente, etc., were operating in, which means that you have to be reading Crowley, you have to be reading Mathers, you have to read a lot of these Golden Dawn texts, okay? Looking into the Hermetica, for example. And these texts are not explicitly about Wicca. And a lot of these writers were very dismissive of Wicca, okay? But that relationship is undeniable. And if you want to kind of understand why does Wicca work the way it does, where does it come from, then you have to look at these older texts. If you're a devotional polytheist, right, you read the original languages of these stories if you can. Maybe that means you have to learn, you have to learn Biblical Greek, or you have to learn Gaelic, or whatever the background of the culture that you're looking at, the deity that you're serving, you have to look into those original languages and stories, what was going on historically, okay? You can't just keep reading books about, Dionysus published, by contemporary Dionysus worshipers today who are using their own UPGs and, writing about their personal experiences. Like, that stuff is great, but if you're looking for that more advanced stuff, then you have to go back further. You have to look at history, and that often is a lot more difficult than just strolling down to the New Age section at Barnes & Noble. These books are not going to be in the magic section. They're not going to be at your typical bookstore, okay? You might end up at an academic library. You might be cozying up to interlibrary loan with your local public library. But that's kind of the next step if that's what you're looking at. Then there's the idea too, if you're interested specifically in Wicca, the fact of the matter is that advanced Wicca is coven Wicca. It's coven-based Wicca, and I think that's just a reality. I'm a Gardnerian, okay? I've been very clear about that. I wrote a book about it. And Wicca comes from a particular time and place, and it's been advanced by particular people according to particular systems and rules, okay? And those things function not just to make people feel bad because they're not initiates, they function that way because that's how they work. And so if you want the inside scoop of what advanced Wicca looks like, then it's time to start seeking a coven. I'm not saying that it necessarily has to be Gardnerian, okay? Like, there are a lot of options out there, but at some point, if you're interested in taking Wicca a step further, then you need to start seeking a coven. That's just true. And that doesn't mean that you have to, you know, live and breathe coven work for the entirety of your life. It doesn't mean that you have to, you know, become a high priest or high priestess at some point. But if you want to get to a certain point, then at some point you have to start doing the work that that entails. And in Wicca's case, that work is coven-based. So that said, that's not true of other kinds of witchcraft. If you're interested in non-Wiccan types, then you potentially have a lot of places that you can look. But again, just as with like devotional polytheism or ceremonial magic, etc., those sources that you're going to be looking for are often going to be academic. You're going to have to look at trial records. You're going to have to look at anthropological texts. A lot of traditional witches cite Ginsberg, who was writing in the 70s, and some of his stuff is kind of hit or miss as far as the academy is concerned, but he's still heavily cited by contemporary practitioners as significant. So, like, you have to read that stuff, okay? And a lot of the time, in order to go back further, the stuff that you're reading is not explicitly about witches. You kind of have to understand that historical context. So coming up with an exact reading list of what constitute advanced books is really difficult without knowing what your end goal is. Like, if this is point A, where is your point B? If your point B is that you want to practice something that is older, more authentic, whatever that means, okay, then there might be particular texts you have to look at. If you're interested in your witchcraft just being more effective, because that's often what we mean when we say advanced. We want something that is more reliable, more effective, more powerful, etc. Often that has hardly anything to do with what you're reading, and more to do with how you practice and how long you've been practicing. And the fact of the matter, too, with practically all of these traditions is that time is a factor. The way to get better, the way to have a more satisfying magical practice or something that feels real or more authentic to you often has to do with its effectiveness in being ingrained into your daily life and routine. And sometimes the question is, how much are you willing to give up in order to get there? Something that's really popular right now, of course, is since A Dark Song came out, the Abermalen working is, like, you can go to Barnes & Noble and find some of these books now. It's really interesting. But this is a particular operation that requires that you make very significant changes to your life. And they're things that a lot of people aren't willing to do. Can you set aside 6 months and get outside of your daily grind and just devote your practice to magic? You know, if you want to be, if you're a devotional polytheist and your deity asks you or instructs you, you know, to not be married and not have children or work a particular kind of job, etc., like, how far are you willing to take whatever your practice is? And one of the things that I've always really liked about witchcraft is that witchcraft, I think, is sort of necessarily practical. It's one of the reasons why people start studying witchcraft instead of ceremonial traditions. It's one of the reasons why traditional witches don't necessarily care for Wicca with its high sense of ceremony. If you want something that's kind of down in the dirt and practical, then the idea of an advanced witchcraft doesn't necessarily mean anything, except how you integrate that into your life. So there's a lot to think about there. So before I start making book videos, which I will because I like talking about books, I think the biggest question to consider is, what is your end goal? What are you actually looking to do? Are you interested in improving your connection to your practice and developing that? Are you interested in practicing something older? Are you interested in exploring the tradition you're already a part of more deeply? Are you interested in working with a particular entity, right? Like, there's a lot of things to consider. So we tend to kind of throw around the phrase advanced books like it means something, and it means a lot of things. So some thoughts, if you have them, leave them in the comments. What I'll probably end up doing is making a series of videos of advanced titles kind of based on varying endpoints. Yeah, so my interest in advancing my own practice as a Wiccan has led me to doing Golden Dawn work, and participating with a local OTO group. So, right, like sometimes things take you off into crazy town, okay? Things that you wouldn't necessarily expect. But no matter what you're looking to do, there's a really good chance that the books you're looking for, if in fact books are what you need, are not going to be at the same bookstores in the same sections where you've been hanging out. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. But anyway, hope you guys have a lovely week.